All right, so what's this psychism thing all about? Did I get bum deal in the DNA lottery if I don't have it? Well, the most important thing I want to tell you is that couldn't be the furthest thing from the truth. Number one, because most of us aren't even taught understanding what that means about psychism. Right? And so how do you even know if you have it or don't have it? Because what I can tell you is that I spent my first 43 years, 42 years, understanding myself as a very traditional, normal, neurotypical, albeit quirky, right? Human being. Never knew that I had any of these things. Turns out, I've spent the last 7 years just getting to know myself. And it turns out all of these challenges and symptoms and sensory overload was me just misunderstanding all my spiritual gifts. And so we're all born with spiritual gifts, but they're much more, generally speaking, starting out, right? It's much more along the lines of intuition than it is the way that sci-fi or, Harry Potter or X-Men or otherwise is, kind of displayed and talked about, psychism and various gifts. Number two, it's also important to understand that while psychism and having and operating with spiritual gifts is not necessarily in itself an indication of one's spiritual evolution over another. It's a decision that's made before one incarnates to determine what type of, how do they need to set up their human suit to learn what they need to learn. And those that have tapped into their spiritual gifts and lived their lives through spiritual gifts understand both the blessing and the curse that comes with, information. So let me assure you, there are also many evolved consciousnesses that have said, hey, look, I've done that. I've been there, done that with the gifts. This incarnation, I want to have a little bit more of a physical experience, and I want to learn through a more materialist view for, as a steward, for whatever reason that might be. That being said, believe me when I tell you, there's more to you than you know. There's more to all of us than we know. By the way, what's kind of the difference between psychism and consciousness? Well, the easy way that I would explain that is consciousness is comprehension. It's the ability it's understanding in a sense. So psychism gives you the ability to access your consciousness, right? If consciousness is your library of knowledge and wealth of information, psychism is the elevator that can help to take you there. Now, some of us, depending again, on one's evolutionary journey, when some people then use their psychism and they get to the library, they're able to navigate on their own. Others need a guide, right? And so again, when you talk to different people, that's also why different people will have different experiences. Some people will have a little bit more of a direct connection when they're tapping in and accessing the information. Others will use guides. Now, some will use more than one guide. And now ultimately, everybody wants to have direct access to the information, just because like a game of Operator, if you remember as a kid, or I think it was Operator, or it starts with one story, and then by the time 8 or 9 people tell it, it ends up being a very different story. Well, so that such can be the same thing with psychism. And when you're going through guides and they're accessing the information and they're telling that to another guide and then they're telling that to you. And along the way, the information comes and sometimes it's abstract, right? In the way that one needs to understand it, which leaves it subject to interpretation, which depending on how it's used can open itself to error if not understood and used properly. Speaking of the psychism and other parties or guides getting involved, why do they get involved? Well, if you remember what I talked about before, that hey, everybody you kind of get to do what you need to do to work stuff out of your system. But the rule is you got to give back 1% more than you took. Well, one of the ways to do that is to help others along. And so if you think of interaction with spirits falling underneath that category, that's much more in line with the intelligent design. Is there stuff that happens outside of that? Are there, just like on the physical plane, the same way that people will try to manipulate people, will spirits try to manipulate people? Yes, that actually happens too. And that's also why it's so important to understand oneself, their gifts, if things are being communicated to them, or if they're getting access directly, and also establishing one's internal truth teller, right? So they can understand, who is safe to be with and who is not. And if you remember, we talked about stewards, right? The responsibility and the role of all humans that incarnate on Earth is for that of stewardship. Well, Psychism and the ability to tap into information is how you are able to talk to nature and animals, right? Being restricted to strictly verbal communication and thinking that verbal communication somehow makes one more intelligent than another could not be more laughable. Right? Those that are restricted to verbal communication only are really missing out on what the world has to offer. Now that said, hey, you're not restricted to verbal communication. That's what I was also trying to tell you, right? But what you do have to understand is that when things come to you, it's going to be more like intuition or a thought in the head, and you're not too sure, where did that thought come from? It's understanding things that way. Well, Graham, how in the world am I supposed to understand all these different energies? That's the great question. That's actually one of the million-dollar questions. That's why empathy is so important, because, information is trapped into energy, but how in the world is one person going to understand the same information from an entity when they speak different languages, come from different cultures, different everything else? Well, how in the world does that, if there is a lack of uniformity, how does that work? Well, this is where, again, you have to experience it to really understand what I'm saying. And if you have experience, then you definitely know what I'm saying. Which is, the energy comes to you, and you may, and many times the vision, the words, the pictures, the guidance is abstract, because that's how you understand it. And so sometimes what is being shown to you as an experience from your past isn't about saying this is what's going to happen to you or this is what you need to prepare for. It's to say, hey, this is the emotion, this is the circumstances, this is what you learned from that. There's a correlation here. There's something that you need to remember from that to help you with this and what you're working on. And so if one wants to expand their psychism, if one wants to expand their ability to understand, then one needs to expand their empathy, which then goes back to acts of service as well. So how does psychism and predicting the future, and what's that all then about, Graham? All right, well, if you remember, part of the intelligent design that I talked about was learning how to operate inside of harmony and preparation. So number one, getting information about the future isn't about gaining advantage, it's about preparation. And so whether one is applying the law of probabilities to energies to predict what they think is going to happen, or whether one is actually looking into their own life and the life that they've planned out for themselves, and being foretold of what they've already agreed to do, that's more of what's happening in the future. It's not that somebody is able to pull randomness or to pull knowledge from what's random that's out there. No. Again, remember, there's an intelligent design. It's purposeful. It's got intent and meaning behind things. So getting glimpses of the future it might be easier to think about that more like setting up Google alerts for yourself. Hey, I want to prepare for these type of events. So before you incarnate, you can set it up so that you will get notified via directly, guides, however, through the universe talking to you. Look, part of your living and learning journey is figuring out that communication for yourself and how you're being communicated with. But once you're being communicated with it, then it's learning that the information is being given to you to help prepare. Now, some of us, that's preparation for self. Some of that's preparation for societies. That's preparation for the world. So the information that we all have access to is going to vary and be relevant to the individual person, their journey, and how they've chosen to act for the highest good of all.